This is All India Radio. Now we bring you an exclusive interview with N.K. Singh, Chairman, 15th Finance Commission. Interviewer is A.K. Bhattacharya, Economic Analyst.
Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented the Union Budget for 2022-23 yesterday in Parliament. She said the economy has shown great resilience in face of the COVID pandemic and is expected to grow at the rate of 9.2%, the highest rate among all major economies. She said the budget is giving a vision for the Amrit Kaal of next 25 years. The total expenditure for 2022-23 is estimated at 39.45 lakh crore rupees and the fiscal deficit is pegged at 6.4% of GDP. The main focus of the budget for 2022-23 is 35.4% increase in capital expenditure from 5.54 lakh crore rupees in 2021-22 to rupees 7.5 lakh crore rupees in 2022-23. The effort said this public investment will have multiplier effect on economic growth and boost the virtuous cycle of job, demand, investment, and crowd in private investment. Under the PM Gati Shakti program, multimodal connectivity will be achieved on 7 fronts: roads, railways, airports, ports, public transport, waterways, and logistics network. National Ropeways Development Program Parvatmala was also announced in the Union Budget. Expansion is planned for National Highways Network in 2022-23 at 25,000 kilometers. PM Gati Shakti Master Plan for Expressways is to be formulated to facilitate faster movement of people and goods. Railways have been allotted 2.38 lakh crore rupees. DFM said 400 Vande Bharat high-speed trains and 100 PM Gati Shakti cargo terminals will be built in next 3 years for multimodal logistics. One station, one product concept will be popularized to help local businesses and supply chain. Emergency Credit Line Guarantee Scheme for micro, small and medium enterprises has been extended by 1 year to March 2023. The guarantee cover has been expanded from 4.5 lakh crore rupees to 5 lakh crore rupees. The additional 50,000 crore rupees has been given for hospitality and other sectors especially hit by the pandemic. Additional credit of rupees 2 lakh crore for MSMEs is to be provided under Credit Guarantee Trust for micro and small enterprises. DFM said in agriculture, procurement of wheat and rice from 163 lakh farmers in Rabi and Kharif seasons 2021-22 has ensured 2.37 lakh crore rupees direct payment of MSP value to their accounts, and this will continue. She talked of promoting use of Kisan drones for crop assessment, digitization of land records, spraying of insecticides and nutrients. 44,605 crore rupees have been allotted for the Ken-Betwa Link project to enhance irrigation networks. Allocation of 60,000 crore rupees has been made for Har Ghar Nal Se Jal to cover 3.8 crore households in 2022-23. 80 lakh houses will be completed in 2022-23 under PM Awas Yojana, both rural and urban. A new Vibrant Villages program will be launched to cover border villages with sparse population, limited connectivity and less infrastructure. 2 lakh Anganwadis are to be upgraded under the Saksham Anganwadi mission. A new scheme, Prime Minister's Development Initiative for Northeast, PM Divine, to be implemented through the Northeastern Council. One Class, One TV channel program of PME Vidya to be expanded from 12 to 200 TV channels. A digital university to be established to provide access to students across the country for world-class quality universal education. Government to set up 75 digital banking units in 75 districts of the country by scheduled commercial banks. 100% of post offices to be brought under the core banking system. Digital rupee using blockchain and other technologies to be issued by RBI from 2022-23. Transfer of virtual digital assets to be taxed at the rate of 30%. e-passport using embedded chip and futuristic technology to be rolled out in 2022-23. Auction of spectrum for rollout of 5G mobile services to be taken up in 2022. It is a progressive, growth-oriented budget with a futuristic vision. Now we bring to you an exclusive interview on the budget with Mr. N.K. Singh, Chairman, 15th Finance Commission. The interviewer is economic analyst Mr. A.K. Bhattacharya.
Welcome, Mr. Singh, for appearing on this special show on the Union Budget for 2022-23 presented on Tuesday, February 1. Let me start by asking you the basic question on the macroeconomic stance of this budget. As we all know that how the fiscal deficit number has been kept at 6.9% of the current year, and it proposes to reduce it to 6.4% of GDP for next year. Given this number background, how would you rate the macroeconomic overall stance of the budget of the finance minister?
So in my view, from the viewpoint of macroeconomic stability, I rate this budget very high for the following three reasons. First and foremost, there was a broad consensus among economic analysts that the time for monetary forbearance was over and that there was need for decisive fiscal action. Therefore, there was a general consensus that she should do much greater fiscal stimulus, which have only added to the fiscal deficit numbers that has really come out. But I think that given the fact that it was done very imaginatively, she has managed to retain the fiscal deficit number at around 6.8, just 6.9, which is neither here nor there, 0.1. But next year, the fiscal consolidation really of half percentage point of GDP, looking at the much greater GDP number today, is a very significant consolidation. But more important than that, I think that the medium-term trajectory of moving to 24.5 fiscal deficit by 25 or so, of having 4.5 as the fiscal deficit by the year 25, is also a continued faith in gradual glide path on the fiscal deficit. Now, the more important question than the fiscal deficit, by the way, I think that I'm sure the listeners know that we're only talking of the fiscal deficit numbers of the central government. As far as the states are concerned, which means when you begin to compute the fiscal numbers of the general government, we need to add the fiscal deficit of the states as well.
That's right.
Therefore, if states are really on an average today, according to my estimation, not at 3%, some states are quite misaligned, like Punjab, it is way over the top. Some states are better managed, but at least it would be fair to add another 4% or so to these fiscal numbers. So we are really talking in terms of not only the number of 6.9, but at least 4.5 more. So the reason why I'm pointing out is that if you look at the fiscal stimulus, which already exists in the system, it is over 13%, which is not small. So when people talk in terms of fiscal stimulus, they should be cognizant.
There is also a suggestion in this union budget, and actually not a suggestion really, the numbers tell us that the interest payment liability for next year will go up to as much as 24% of the total government expenditure size.
Yes.
And as a result, it will have an impact on the central government's debt to GDP ratio. How do you see that equation panning out?
That was the next question. I'm glad you have asked that question. That was the next question I was coming to. So looking at the fact that there is a credible glide path on the fiscal deficit numbers of the central government, nonetheless, the debt to GDP is turning out to be 60% for the central government alone. But if you calibrate the fact that 1.5% can be shaved off on account of the small savings really being the liability of the state government, the debt to the central government would be in the region of about 58.5% of the central government. Add to it at least 30% of the states as a whole, we are already talking in terms of the debt to GDP of around close to 90%, not more. And this is really, if you ask me, a rather elevated debt number. So what do we do about it? I think in my view, it is worrisome. No, because several reasons. One, most of it is domestic debt. A lot of it, the external debt, is multilateral debt. And also because if we stick to the path of fiscal consolidation roadmap, you will see a downward adjustment in southward direction of the debt to GDP. No spectacular change can take place because you know very well the debt stock is very high, and that moves rather slowly as compared to you can play around with fiscal numbers much more rapidly. And the most important which I want to say is I closely went through the IMF Fiscal Policy Monitor, which was published on the 31st of October, and they are recommending two things: that emerging markets who have faced the pandemic and the fiscal crisis of the pandemic can take up to a 10-year longer period to come back to the original trajectory which they had in mind. So from that point of view, it would be quite consistent with the prescription as long as there is a fiscal rule in place. And what we don't have, of course, is something which we have a fiscal rule, but we do not have fiscal institutions. So the real missing link is the need for independent, credible fiscal institutions. But on the whole, I think that macroeconomic consolidation is not a matter of concern.
One question, Mr. Singh, on the macroeconomic area. The primary deficit, it used to range at around 0.1 or 1% of GDP, has now gone up to more than 3% of GDP. Now, is that something that you would consider, and how would you like it to be handled? Will growth enough be enough? Will be alone enough?
It's a very good question. Two comments. Yeah. One, of course, for the listeners, we should explain that the primary deficit is nothing but fiscal deficit net of interest. So you take the interest out, and on the fiscal deficit, you're going to get the primary deficit. Now, we must also recognize that this primary deficit, which you mentioned, was much higher if you look at the number last year and the year before last. The primary deficit has come down in the last 2 years or so. And if we continue on the path of fiscal consolidation and continue to really improve the likely outcomes from expenditure, which, by the way, we can touch on, which is really the emphasis on the capex expenditure, which has certain virtual growth circles, I think that the primary deficit would get equally calibrated in a more acceptable range.
You talked about the expenditure, Mr. Singh. Moving on to the expenditure side of the budget, this budget will probably be remembered for the huge increase on capex by around 35%. If you exclude the one-off infusion of capital into Air India, which was sold a couple of months ago. Now, this 35% of capex increase is probably sustain the kind of investment and the investment shortfall that the private sector is not right now making. But do you think that 1 lakh crore of loans, the interest-free loans, should have been included in this thing, or it should have been kept out of the capex calculation?
No, the 1 lakh crore is included in the capex calculation from what I read. But don't forget that she has said it's non-interest bearing, and that's a very major thing. It's an interest-free loan with a long tenor, and the tenor is fairly long on the payment of the interest. So hedged against inflation, it would turn out to be really a grant for all practical purposes. Could be on the books as a loan. But more important is the fact that this will enable the virtuous circles around higher capex expenditure by the state. In the state highways, in the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, it has a direct impact on the informal sector. It has a direct employment on the job creation for the informal sector. And this is something, in my view, is one of the really commendable features of not neglecting the states, but taking a double action. One of proceeding ahead based on the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission by giving them an extra borrowing of 1 percentage point of GDP from 3% point to 4% point, out of which 0.5% is for the power sector reforms which have been articulated. So 1 percentage point extra borrowing is quite. And second is 1 lakh crore interest-free over a very long tenor period would enable the state governments to improve the state-level infrastructure. And as part of the whole program of not only improving the comparative efficiency of the economy, but more importantly, job creation and improving the support mechanisms for the informal sector.
Mr. Singh, talking about 1 lakh crore of interest-free 50-year loan to the states, are we getting back to the idea of the centrally sponsored scheme by a different name?
Not at all. This is one-off. On centrally sponsored schemes, very frankly, have not closely studied the number, and you could prompt me, what is the expenditure which they have projected? Because it used to be in the region of 2.5 lakhs per annum of the central government alone. And equally, depending on the proportionality, let us say around that figure of the state government. So around 5 lakh crore was the expenditure on centrally sponsored schemes, in addition to central outlays, which were being separately financed. But I would expect the deeper consolidation on the centrally sponsored schemes as well, to which they were committed to in terms of greater broadbanding, getting rid of really boutique centrally sponsored schemes, which were not particularly productive.
On the expenditure side, Mr. Singh, we talked about the capex seeing a record increase of 35% in 1 year, but this is also probably 1 year where the revenue expenditure will see a lowest increase of less than 1% for next year. Now, the assumptions of a very, very small 0.86% increase in revenue expenditure is contingent on a sharp reduction in subsidies, major subsidies, close to around 26% for next year. In a year when petroleum prices are going up, with fertilizer subsidy bill may go up, maybe the food subsidy bill may have to be continued if the COVID continues. So what is your assessment of the revenue expenditure squeeze that one has seen? How would you see this in the overall equation of expenditure management?
So I think that one of the very positive features has been that if you see the path on the whole macroeconomic framework, not only do we see a glide path in terms of the fiscal deficit, but we see a glide path on the revenue deficits as well. And as you rightly point out, that there has been a sharp reduction in the revenue deficit, which is largely emanating from recalibration on the outgo on subsidies of fertilizers and on the public distribution system as a whole. So if one is wanting to talk of uncertainties, there are 4 or 5 uncertainties, none of which are necessarily unconnected. One is the geopolitics and the behavior of the crude prices in the medium term. We don't know. The second is the path of the pandemic. We haven't seen the lasting or unexpected surprises. So these two are 2 very important uncertainties. The third is the fact that the consequences of this, following on the entire subsidy picture, and what it would do to put pressure on various subsidies of one kind or the other. But that is also connected with, if you ask me, whether the real GDP number for next year, which means really coming to a nominal GDP of around 11.2% for next year, based on an 8% real GDP number. On the 11.2%, which would be very good if it is based on an 8% real GDP, because if anything, some analysts have examined that it has taken an undercredit on the likely deflator and making the best of assumptions on the deflator being far more modest. And that is really a cushion, if you ask me, because if the deflator goes up, then instead of you can live with a somewhat lower real GDP number. So I think that the GDP projections are pretty realistic. But the important issue is whether this tax buoyancy in the same way would continue and replicate itself. So a lot on that depends on the fact of how soon the government gets down finishing the incomplete agenda on the GST reform to begin with, because the whole issue of inverted duty structure, broadbanding of rates, these require enlarging the coverage of the GST to include the items which are left out. This, if you ask me, is an important agenda.
That is indeed true, Mr. Singh. GST reform is a very important aspect. But then, as you would also recognize that GST is something that is outside the purview of the union budget right now, is part of the GST Council's agenda. But you took the discussion to the subject which I wanted to take to, which is taxation. This budget has very few proposals on taxation, and probably the revenue growth numbers for next year are very, very modest in terms of probably, would you agree with this assessment that tax rates have remained stable, there is no disruption, and yet there is an attempt at under-promising and overachieving in terms of revenue collection numbers for next year?
Those are then should be viewed with a degree of gratification and compliment to the management of the revenue department and the leadership of the PM and the finance minister, that normally you end up in promising much greater revenues and you start scrambling around for revenue numbers. But this doesn't appear to be. But the fact remains that one important fact I'm sure you would have noticed, that the taxes as a percentage of GDP is projected at 10.7. The 10.7 is really an improvement on the tax numbers which we have seen for the exact reasons which you have discussed a little earlier. My calculation suggests that the slackness in compliance, not so much the rates, other structural rectifications like the one on GST, which you have mentioned, and some further changes on the whole direct tax mechanism, and plugging more loopholes. The projections which we made in the Finance Commission was that perhaps could be escaping about 4 percentage points of GDP on the taxes from without tinkering the rates in an upward direction one could get. So I think that the emphasis should be on plugging loopholes, on improved compliance, and certainly on the reforms of the indirect taxes which we have mentioned.
On the important issue of tax to GDP ratio, Mr. Singh, I remember when you were the Revenue Secretary in the Union government, the tax to GDP ratio for the center used to be as high as 11 or even 11.5%. And now, what should be the ideal level for the central tax to GDP ratio? And you are the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. So what would be your recommendation on this front?
Let's put it exactly what made a comment per se, that if current rates, if the compliance rationalization change effect is around 4%, taking the thing that was written last year, one would say that one should really look at about in the region of about 12% or so on the tax to GDP for the government as a whole. And I think the fact that we have moved up, not moved down, in spite of the pandemic is a good sign. And there is a handsome payoff if what the FM said yesterday, that January has seen an astounding highest absolute amount in terms of the GST realization, then I think that it augurs well, and if the economic revival takes place, you would see direct taxes also looking up in a significant way. I think it will be realistic to aim at around 12% or so.
How do you view, Mr. Singh, the two taxes? One is in the cryptocurrencies, 1% of DDS, and the other is the custom duty changes, essentially phasing out exemptions and imposing some custom duty on capital goods and project imports. The custom duty increases changes are being seen as encouraging self-reliant India, and cryptocurrencies is to plug the kind of a loophole in the system. How would you see both these tax initiatives?
Well, on the customs, I think that there is an element of rationalization, and as you have correctly pointed out, that particularly as far as the electronic sector is concerned, I find that the market reaction is a positive one. The domestic electronic manufacturers, including, for instance, the relief given for the domestic manufacture of solar panels, which from the viewpoint of the green energy, and we should mention about the green energy transition as another important area, which is following the commitments made at the COP26 in terms of the Panchamrit. Therefore, I see that the customs rationalization, overall weighted customs tariff, would not really suggest that India would not reinforce the suggestion made by some experts that are we moving towards a more protectionist economy. I don't see that kind of a dominant streak. I see that it has been well targeted to areas where I think that domestic capability and the domestic sector is poised for a takeoff. So I see that as the first thing. On the crypto, I must say that I think still a very gray area. See, as far as the currency being issued by the Reserve Bank is concerned, that is no-brainer. That this was a proposal in the offing for last 2 years, the Reserve Bank having its own. It's not a crypto, it's a digital currency, and there is no proposal of currency being taxed in any way, central bank currencies, by taxing a bank note. But so I think that let's leave there are two parts to it. One is the digital currency to be issued by the Reserve Bank of India based on a very small change in the Banking Act, based on which the Reserve Bank can go ahead. The second is the question of the taxation of crypto assets, so to say, if I may say so, based on the blockchain technology. Very frankly, I think that has not been said. The reason being not in terms of what she has said. She has taken an exceedingly, in my view, a very good judgment, practical call, that when the rules of the game will be settled, they will be settled. But in the meantime, if all these chaps are making money, why not get with TDS deduction? Why not get the 30%? No other tax deductions or benefit. Not so subtle way, if I will say so, of discouraging crypto assets. But at the same time, if that is so, then at least realizing the tax out of it.
Mr. Singh, we're coming to the end of the interview. I have to ask you this question. All budgets have a reforms quotient. How would you rate the budget? How reformist the budget has been? What kind of reform signals the budget has given? Would you like to say a few words on them?
Yes, certainly. But I'll only one sentence on the crypto asset and I'll move on to answer this question. And that sentence is this, that I have for long pleaded that this is a complex subject with different sovereign nations adopting different standards. This is a subject important enough for the International Monetary Fund to take the initiative for an international consensus on what kind of a framework would be responsible for the global community to adopt. And I think that that's an area when the first Deputy Managing Director of the fund was here, that was very much a subject, Geeta Gopinath, that was a subject which came up in more than one discussion. On the question of the reform quotient, we say that both of us have been actor, player in the whole budget thing from, as we have seen, the evolution. So pre-91, if you ask me, that the entire emphasis was on calibration of income tax, excise rates, which were galore, customs rates which were galore, and the emphasis was on rationalization of rates and predictability of taxes. Post-91, the focus changed to reforms, which meant structural reforms. Now, I think that it is time now that we say goodbye to that, because the bulk of the reforms, including on factors of production, are behind us, in the sense that they are in the realm of implementation. The asset monetization, if you ask me, is a very major reform which has taken place. So it's the issue of the implementation of the most important reforms which are outlined outside the budget and articulated also in the last year's budget, and we should focus on seeing their implementation. So I thought that's a very good thing that, this budget was not pretending to be a budget of shock and awe. This budget has been designed to be exactly what it is, embedded in the much greater ground reality and emphasizing on the need for the implementation of the many. It said so also, that I'll watch very carefully the implementation of these reforms which are currently underway. At the same time, I will say, look at several important areas where some of these signals are there. Now, we know that if you regard the repealing of the farm law to be a setback in the agricultural sector, but people have not noticed that there are several important initiatives in the agricultural sector, some of which are contained also in the Finance Commission report, like crop diversification, moving away from just cereals into vegetables, into fruits, into more water-efficient cropping patterns, into developing capability on agro products, which currently we are just relying on imports on better recycling of agro waste. Not many focus that the issue, particularly those of us who live in Delhi like us, every year on the stubble burning, increasing use of the biomass for recycling of agro waste. So the agricultural sector has received a new kind of a thrust, a bit understated. By the way, I would say that the digitization of land records, if you ask me very frankly, is a very, very important reform, because you cannot bring the market forces to work in the agricultural sector. Your land records on agriculture in terms of title and transference and so on remain so opaque. So the thrust on digitization of land records for agriculture is an important, very, very productive from the viewpoint of the farming community, who would have greater clarity on titles and the likely market value of his agricultural land.
On budget, we could have gone on and on, have this wonderful discussion. Thank you for your valuable time.
Thank you very much.
You were listening to an exclusive interview with N.K. Singh, Chairman, 15th Finance Commission. Interviewer was A.K. Bhattacharya, Economic Analyst. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.